Imagine a world where just four men, unelected, largely unknown to the public, held the power to shape the fate of nations. A world where decisions taken in quiet offices, behind closed doors, could trigger mass unemployment, political extremism, and global collapse. This is not a conspiracy thriller. This is real history, and it is the story of how the global economy slid from post-war hope into the deepest economic disaster the modern world has ever known. In Lords of Finance, Liaquat Ahamed tells the gripping, human story of the central bankers whose beliefs, fears, and mistakes helped turn financial instability into the Great Depression. The book opens in August 1931, at the height of the global financial crisis. Montague Norman, governor of the Bank of England and the most powerful central banker in the world, suffers a nervous breakdown as the international banking system teeters on collapse. This moment symbolizes the wider failure of global financial leadership. Ahamed introduces the four central bankers at the heart of the story: Montague Norman of Britain, Benjamin Strong of the United States, Hjalmar Schacht of Germany, and Émile Moreau of France, and explains that their attempt to rebuild the global financial system after World War I would ultimately end in catastrophe. Part 1. The Unexpected Storm. Chapter 1. Prologue. Before August 1914, the world economy rested on a fragile but extraordinarily successful system. London stood at the heart of global finance, acting as the clearinghouse for international trade and capital flows. Money moved across borders with remarkable ease, financing railways in distant colonies, factories in emerging economies, and massive infrastructure projects that tied continents together. At the center of it all stood the gold standard, a monetary system that fixed currencies to a specific quantity of gold and, in doing so, bound nations together in a web of mutual financial discipline. This system had delivered decades of relative stability. Prices rose and fell gently, trade expanded, and economic downturns were usually brief. To politicians, bankers, and intellectuals of the time, the gold standard was not merely a technical arrangement. It was a moral code. It symbolized prudence, restraint, and responsibility. Many believe it had made large-scale war obsolete. Economic interdependence, they argued, had become so deep that war between great powers would be irrational and self-destructive. That belief proved catastrophically wrong. When war erupted in the summer of 1914, the financial system collapsed with astonishing speed. Stock exchanges shut their doors, international payments froze, and the flow of credit that sustained global trade simply stopped. The very mechanisms that had created prosperity now transmitted panic. The First World War did not just destroy lives and cities. It shattered the financial foundations of the modern world, leaving behind a wreckage that central bankers would struggle to rebuild for the next 2 decades. Chapter 2. A Strange and Lonely Man, Britain, 1914. Montague Norman, who would later become the most powerful central banker of his age, was an unlikely figure to stand at the center of global finance. Tall, eccentric, deeply introverted, and prone to severe bouts of depression, Norman never fully fit into the rigid social world of British banking. Though he came from an elite financial family, his temperament was artistic and philosophical rather than commercial. Music, mysticism, and introspection fascinated him far more than balance sheets. When war broke out, Britain faced an immediate financial emergency. Foreign investors rushed to withdraw gold, banks feared insolvency, and London's position as the world's financial hub was suddenly in jeopardy. Norman, then a senior figure at the Bank of England, helped coordinate emergency measures to prevent total collapse. The stock exchange was closed, payments were suspended, and extraordinary interventions were made to preserve confidence. The crisis temporarily gave Norman clarity and purpose, but also reinforced his belief that financial order depended on discipline and orthodoxy. The experience would shape his lifelong conviction that stability must always be defended, even at great cost. Beneath his calm exterior, however, Norman remained psychologically fragile, a fact that would later have profound consequences when the system he sought to preserve began to crumble. Chapter 3. The Young Wizard, Germany, 1914. In Germany, the war catapulted Hjalmar Schacht into prominence. Brilliant, ambitious, and supremely confident, Schacht represented a new generation of German financiers eager to restore national strength. The war forced Germany off the gold standard, freeing the government to print money to finance military operations. Initially, this seemed painless. Unlike Britain and France, Germany avoided heavy taxation and relied instead on borrowing and monetary expansion. Schacht quickly distinguished himself through his technical expertise and political agility. He understood finance not just as a set of rules, but as a tool of national power. As inflation began to creep into the economy, Schacht grasped both its dangers and its opportunities. His rise during the war years laid the foundation for his later role as the man who would both save and destabilize Germany's economy in the turbulent years ahead. Chapter 4. A Safe Pair of Hands. The United States, 1914. Across the Atlantic, Benjamin Strong emerged as the steady anchor of the international financial system. As head of the Federal Reserve Bank of New York, Strong oversaw the most powerful node in America's young central banking system. Unlike Europe, the United States entered the war late and emerged economically dominant. Gold flowed into American vaults, and New York began to rival London as a global financial center. Strong believed deeply in international cooperation. He saw central bankers as guardians of a shared system rather than servants of narrow national interests. During the war and its aftermath, he cultivated close relationships with his European counterparts, especially Montague Norman. Strong's pragmatism and willingness to innovate would make him indispensable in the 1920s as the world struggled to rebuild a functioning financial order. Chapter 5. L'Inspecteur de Finances, France, 1914. France's experience of the war left deep scars. Vast regions were physically devastated, millions were killed or wounded, and national survival itself seemed to have been at stake. Émile Moreau, a senior French financial official, embodied this trauma. Suspicious of foreign intentions and deeply conservative in his outlook, Moreau believed financial strength was inseparable from national security. France, like its allies, suspended the gold standard during the war and financed its efforts through borrowing and money creation. Inflation followed, eroding savings and fueling resentment. For Moreau, these experiences hardened a determination that France would never again be financially vulnerable. This mindset would later drive French policy in ways that destabilized the international system. Chapter 6. Money Generals, Central Banks, 1914 to 1919. The First World War transformed central bankers into financial generals. Governments demanded unlimited funds, and central banks obliged by abandoning pre-war constraints. Money printing replaced gold discipline, and debt soared to unprecedented levels. Inflation spread across Europe, wiping out middle-class savings and undermining trust in money itself. By the time the war ended, the old financial order was gone. Currencies were unstable, debts were massive, and international lending networks lay in ruins. Central bankers now faced a daunting task: to reconstruct a system that no longer had firm foundations, while political pressures and social unrest mounted across the continent. Part 2. After the Deluge. Chapter 7. Demented Inspirations, German Reparations. The Treaty of Versailles imposed crushing reparations on Germany, designed to punish and weaken the defeated nation. These payments were not just economically damaging, they were politically explosive. Germany lacked the capacity to generate the required surpluses, forcing it to borrow abroad simply to meet its obligations. This circular system destabilized both Germany and its creditors. Reparations poisoned relations between nations and became a central obstacle to recovery. For German citizens, the payments symbolized humiliation and injustice, fueling resentment that would later be exploited by extremist movements. Chapter 8. Uncle Shylock, War Debts. At the same time, European allies owed vast sums to the United States. America insisted on full repayment, arguing that debts were a matter of principle. Yet this insistence ignored economic reality. The only way Europe could pay was through German reparations or by exporting goods to the U.S., both of which were politically and economically constrained. This rigid stance created a global debt trap. Money flowed in artificial loops, masking underlying weakness and making the entire system dependent on continued American lending. Chapter 9. A barbarous relic, the gold standard. Central bankers sought salvation in a return to the gold standard. They believed restoring pre-war exchange rates would bring stability and confidence. But the world had changed. Economies were burdened with debt, societies were fractured, and political tolerance for deflation was thin. By treating gold as sacred, policymakers imposed deflationary pressure on already fragile economies. Unemployment rose, wages fell, and social tensions deepened. The system designed to ensure stability became a source of relentless strain. Part 3. Sowing a New Wind. Chapter 10. A Bridge Between Chaos and Hope. Germany, 1923. Germany's hyperinflation reached its climax in 1923. Money became worthless, savings vanished overnight, and social order teetered on collapse. Schacht stepped in with a bold stabilization plan, introducing a new currency backed by confidence rather than gold. The reform worked. Inflation was halted, trust restored, and Germany regained a measure of stability. But the social damage was immense. The middle class had been destroyed, and faith in democratic institutions was badly weakened. Chapter 11. The Dawes Opening, Germany, 1924. The Dawes Plan restructured reparations and opened the floodgates to American loans. Capital poured into Germany, factories revived, and prosperity seemed to return. International cooperation appeared triumphant. Yet beneath the surface, the recovery rested on fragile foundations. Europe's stability depended on continuous American credit, and the structural flaws of the system remained unresolved. The calm that followed was not a solution, but a pause before the next storm. Chapter 12. The Golden Chancellor, Britain, 1925. By the mid-1920s, Britain faced a painful dilemma. The war had weakened its industrial base, wages were high, productivity was low, and exports struggled to compete. Yet Montague Norman and much of the British establishment remained obsessed with restoring the pound to its pre-war glory. Returning to the gold standard at the old exchange rate was seen as a matter of national honor, proof that Britain was still a great power. Against the warnings of economists like John Maynard Keynes, Britain rejoined the gold standard in 1925. The decision instantly overvalued the pound, making British goods expensive abroad and squeezing already struggling industries such as coal, steel, and textiles. To defend the currency, interest rates were kept high, forcing wages down and unemployment up. Instead of revival, Britain entered years of stagnation. Norman viewed the pain as necessary discipline, believing that short-term suffering would restore long-term stability. Chapter 13. L.A. Butterley, France, 1926. France took a very different path. After years of inflation and political turmoil, Émile Moreau stabilized the franc at a deliberately undervalued rate. This choice revived exports and restored confidence, but it also gave France a powerful competitive advantage. Gold flowed steadily into Paris, filling the vaults of the Banque de France. Rather than recycling this gold back into the global system, France hoarded it. Moreau saw gold accumulation as insurance against future vulnerability. This policy drained liquidity from other economies, tightening global credit and placing enormous strain on countries still struggling to recover. France achieved stability at the expense of the wider system. Chapter 14. The First Squalls, 1926 to 1927. The global economy appeared calm on the surface, but warning signs were multiplying. Britain stagnated under the weight of deflation. Germany relied heavily on foreign loans. France absorbed gold at an alarming rate. The entire system depended increasingly on American credit and cooperation. Benjamin Strong worked tirelessly behind the scenes to hold the fragile structure together. He coordinated with European central banks, smoothed crises, and delayed reckoning. But the balance was becoming ever more precarious, and the margin for error was shrinking. Chapter 15. Un petit coup de whiskey, 1927 to 1928. In 1927, central bankers gathered in the United States in an effort to relieve pressure on Britain. At Norman's urging, Benjamin Strong lowered American interest rates to encourage capital to flow out of the U.S. and ease Britain's burden. The policy achieved its immediate goal, but unleashed unintended consequences. Cheap credit flooded American markets, fueling a surge in stock market speculation. Asset prices soared far beyond underlying economic reality. The seeds of the Wall Street crash were sown not through greed alone, but through a misguided attempt at international financial cooperation. Part 4. Reaping Another Whirlwind. Chapter 16. Into the Vortex, 1928 to 1929. As speculation intensified, central bankers hesitated. Raising rates risked international collapse. Doing nothing encouraged further excess. Benjamin Strong's death in 1928 removed the one figure capable of decisive coordination. By 1929, the system spun out of control. When the stock market finally cracked, confidence evaporated. What began as a financial correction quickly threatened the real economy. Chapter 17. Purging the Rottenness, 1929 to 1930. After the crash, policymakers believed the downturn was necessary and even healthy. Weak banks were allowed to fail, credit was tightened, and governments prioritized balanced budgets over relief. This belief proved disastrous. Bank failures multiplied, lending collapsed, and businesses closed. What might have been a short recession hardened into a deep and persistent depression. Chapter 18. Magneto Trouble, 1930 to 1931. The crisis spread across borders. The collapse of Austria's Kreditanstalt sent shockwaves through Europe. Panic reached Germany, triggering massive capital flight and banking failure. International cooperation broke down as nations scrambled to protect their own reserves. Trust vanished, and the global financial system began to disintegrate. Chapter 19. A Loose Cannon on the Deck of the World, 1931. Political instability magnified economic collapse. In Germany, unemployment soared and faith in democracy eroded. Extremist movements gained momentum, feeding on despair and resentment. Financial crisis and political radicalization became mutually reinforcing forces, pushing Europe toward catastrophe. Chapter 20. Gold Fetters, 1931 to 1933. As economies collapsed, central bankers clung desperately to the gold standard. Deflation intensified, wages fell, and unemployment reached unprecedented levels. One by one, countries abandoned gold, finding immediate relief once freed from its constraints. Britain left first, followed later by the United States and others. Part 5. Aftermath. Chapter 21. Gold Standard on the Booze, 1933. In 1933, Franklin Roosevelt decisively broke America's link to gold. The move shocked traditionalists but allowed prices to rise and economic activity to revive. The era of rigid monetary orthodoxy was over. Chapter 22. The Caravan's Move On, 1933 to 1944. A new understanding of economics slowly emerged. Governments accepted responsibility for managing demand and stabilizing economies. John Maynard Keynes's ideas gained influence, reshaping policy across the world. The trauma of the Depression transformed how nations thought about money, employment, and state power. Chapter 23. Epilogue. The men who once ruled global finance faded into obscurity. Their decisions, shaped by fear, pride, and rigid belief, left a lasting mark on history. Lords of Finance closes as a cautionary tale. When economic systems are treated as immutable truths rather than tools to serve society, the consequences can be devastating. Lords of Finance shows how a handful of powerful central bankers, acting with good intentions but rigid beliefs, helped turn financial instability into the Great Depression. Bound by their faith in the gold standard and old economic rules, they prioritized monetary orthodoxy over human suffering, deepening unemployment, political unrest, and global collapse. The book's lasting warning is clear. Economic systems are human creations, not sacred laws. When leaders cling to dogma instead of adapting to reality, the consequences can reshape history and cost generations their future.